The country is not collapsing because it lost a war. It is collapsing because it is still trying to fight one. Not on a battlefield. On its balance sheet, its currency is breaking faster than its military position. And almost no one is looking at the numbers that show it. While headlines follow missiles and speeches, the real damage is happening in bond markets, in energy payments, in shipping insurance rates that have quietly doubled in months. I did not predict the war. Wars are predictable. I predicted the mechanism that would break a state after the war began. And that mechanism is now visible, not in statements, in transactions that no longer clear. Do you believe a country can lose a war without losing a single decisive battle? I am Liang Wu. I track how states use money, logistics, and time as instruments of power. If you find value in that, subscribe. There is more coming that will not be reported clearly elsewhere. What matters now is not the front line. It is the structure behind it. In 2026, global trade is still moving through a system built on dollar clearing and maritime insurance dominated by a small group of firms. When a country is partially cut out of that system, the effect is delayed, not immediate. That delay creates the illusion of stability. Russia experienced this after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, when the central bank reserves held abroad were frozen and major banks were removed from SWIFT. Yet oil exports continued, and revenue flowed through alternative channels. For a time, it appeared manageable. That was the visible surface. What most people did not register is that Russia's federal budget shifted into persistent deficit as military spending rose sharply through 2023 and 2024, while discounted oil sales reduced net revenue per barrel. The Ministry of Finance data showed growing reliance on domestic borrowing and the National Wealth Fund. At the same time, the ruble experienced repeated pressure, forcing emergency rate hikes by the central bank, including a move to 20% in 2022 and later sharp increases again in 2023. These are not signs of immediate collapse. They are signs of structural strain. Now extend that pattern to a country with a weaker industrial base, higher import dependence, and less access to alternative buyers. That is where the current collapse is forming. The country I am referring to is Iran. Not because it is losing a war in the conventional sense, but because it is attempting to sustain regional military commitments while under tightening financial constraints that are no longer offset by oil revenue in the same way as before. This is the part that was not obvious. Iran's economy has operated under sanctions for years. That is not new. What is new is the convergence of three pressures at once. First, enforcement has become more targeted. The United States has increased monitoring of shadow fleet oil shipments, particularly those moving to China. Second, insurance and shipping costs have risen due to instability in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical choke points in global energy trade. Around 20% of the world's petroleum liquids pass through that corridor, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. When risk premiums rise, even sanctioned exports become harder to move profitably. Third, and most important, domestic fiscal pressure inside Iran has intensified. The Iranian rial has experienced long-term depreciation, but recent movements have accelerated during periods of regional escalation. Inflation has remained high, with official figures often contested, but widely estimated above 30% in recent years. Verify latest Iranian inflation rate 2025-2026. This erodes internal stability. It changes how long a government can sustain external commitments. The surface fact is simple. Iran continues to project influence through regional proxies and maintains a posture of strategic resistance. That is what is visible. One layer deeper, this behavior reveals something more constrained. It suggests that Iran cannot afford to disengage without losing deterrence credibility, yet cannot afford to escalate without increasing financial isolation. That is not a position of strength. It is a narrowing corridor. Go one layer deeper again. What does that mean over 5 to 10 years? It means the state is entering a phase where economic exhaustion, not military defeat, becomes the primary risk. This is historically rare but not unprecedented. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it lost a single war. It collapsed after a prolonged period of economic strain that made its external commitments unsustainable. Iran is not the Soviet Union. The scale is different. The structure is different. But the pattern of pressure is recognizable. There is also a contradiction here that complicates the analysis. Iran has developed resilience mechanisms that many analysts underestimated. It has built alternative trade networks, increased non-oil exports, and deepened ties with countries willing to bypass Western systems. Its membership in organizations like BRICS, verify Iran's formal BRICS status and date, signals an attempt to integrate into parallel economic structures. This should, in theory, reduce vulnerability. But those structures are not yet capable of fully replacing the existing global system. Trade conducted outside dollar clearing often carries higher transaction costs and lower efficiency. Insurance coverage is weaker. Dispute resolution mechanisms are less established. These frictions accumulate. They do not stop trade, they reduce its quality. Over time, that reduction becomes a strategic constraint. So the visible narrative says Iran is holding its ground. The deeper reality is that it is financing that position under worsening terms. And the deepest layer is that time is no longer neutral. Time is now working against the state's financial capacity to sustain its strategy. This is why the collapse appears sudden when it comes, because it does not begin at the moment of crisis. It begins years earlier, in small adjustments that seem manageable. A discount on oil here, a higher insurance premium there, a budget deficit that is explained as temporary. Each step is rational. Together they form a trajectory, and that trajectory is now visible enough that it can no longer be ignored. The diplomatic layer reveals a different kind of constraint. Not pressure from adversaries, but distance from partners. On the surface, Iran is not isolated in the way it was a decade ago. It maintains formal relations with Russia and China. It has deepened ties through energy agreements and security coordination. It has entered regional normalization talks at different points, including the 2023 Saudi-Iran agreement brokered by China. That agreement restored diplomatic relations after 7 years. It was presented as a turning point. Look one layer deeper. That agreement did not remove strategic rivalry. It managed it. Saudi Arabia did not align with Iran. It reduced direct confrontation to stabilize its own economic transition under Vision 2030. China did not intervene out of alignment with Iran. It intervened to secure energy flows and reduce volatility that threatens its own growth. Russia did not deepen ties with Iran out of shared long-term objectives. It did so under pressure from its own sanctions environment after 2022. These are transactional relationships, not structural alliances. This distinction matters. Transactional relationships can absorb short-term pressure. They do not absorb systemic collapse. When Iran faces increasing financial strain, these partners do not automatically extend support at scale. China continues to purchase Iranian oil, often at discounted rates, but it does so through intermediaries and opaque channels. This reduces Iran's revenue while maintaining China's supply security. It is an asymmetric arrangement. Consider the position of India. It is rarely centered in Western analysis of Iran, yet its policy choices alter the entire picture. India was once a major buyer of Iranian crude. In 2018, after the United States withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action under President Donald Trump, India reduced imports significantly to avoid secondary sanctions. It shifted toward suppliers like Iraq and Saudi Arabia. At the same time, India maintained strategic interest in Iran through the Chabahar Port Project, which provides access to Afghanistan and Central Asia, bypassing Pakistan. India's position is careful. It does not seek confrontation with Iran. It does not seek alignment against it. It seeks access and flexibility. That means it will not step in as a stabilizing economic partner if Iran's financial position deteriorates further. It will maintain limited engagement where it serves its interests, but it will not absorb risk that could affect its own access to Western markets. This creates a gap. Iran has partners but not backstops. Move one layer deeper. What does this mean for Iran's diplomatic leverage? It means leverage is conditional and reversible. In negotiations, whether over nuclear issues or regional security, Iran cannot rely on a coalition willing to offset economic pressure indefinitely. The European parties to the JCPOA have already demonstrated limited ability to shield Iran from sanctions through mechanisms like INSTEX, which failed to deliver meaningful trade volume. Russia and China can provide partial relief, but not full integration. The deepest consequence is that diplomacy becomes constrained by time. Iran must negotiate from a position that weakens as financial pressure accumulates. That shifts the internal calculus. Concessions that were politically impossible 5 years ago may become necessary under fiscal strain. But making those concessions carries its own risk. It can signal weakness to both domestic audiences and regional adversaries. This is the diplomatic trap. Engage and risk internal legitimacy. refuse and risk economic exhaustion. There is another contradiction here. Iran's regional posture, particularly through non-state actors, was designed to create strategic depth and deterrence. Groups in Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen extend Iran's influence beyond its borders. But maintaining those networks requires resources. Funding, logistics, and political coordination all have costs. As fiscal pressure rises, sustaining that network becomes harder. Yet reducing support weakens deterrence. So the very system designed to protect the state becomes another source of strain. The surface narrative still shows Iran active across the region. The deeper reality is that each engagement carries a higher marginal cost. And the deepest layer is that diplomacy cannot resolve this without altering the underlying economic structure, which current partners are not equipped to do, leaving one question unresolved about how long these relationships can sustain even limited support. There is a layer beneath diplomacy that is less visible and more decisive. It concerns the structure of global enforcement itself. Sanctions are often described as political tools. They are not. They are system-level constraints embedded in financial infrastructure. When the United States imposes secondary sanctions, it is not simply restricting direct transactions. It is forcing third parties to choose between access to the U.S. financial system and engagement with the sanctioned entity. Given that the dollar remains dominant in global trade settlement, this choice is rarely neutral. On the surface, countries have developed workarounds. China uses yuan-denominated transactions for some energy imports. Russia has expanded use of its SPFS messaging system as an alternative to SWIFT. Iran conducts barter trade and uses intermediaries to obscure transaction origins. These mechanisms exist. They function, but they operate at the margins of the system, not at its core. One layer deeper, these workarounds introduce inefficiencies that accumulate over time. Transactions take longer, costs increase, legal risks expand, insurance coverage becomes fragmented. According to the International Group of P&I Clubs, which provides liability coverage for approximately 90% of global shipping tonnage, access to standardized insurance is critical for large-scale maritime trade. When vessels operate outside this system, they face higher premiums or limited coverage. This directly affects the cost structure of exports. Go deeper again. The implication is not just higher costs. It is reduced scalability. Iran can continue to export oil under sanctions, but scaling those exports to levels that fully fund state expenditure becomes increasingly difficult under constrained logistics and financing. This is where many analyses stop. They focus on revenue levels. The more important factor is revenue quality. Revenue that is discounted, delayed, or encumbered by intermediaries does not provide the same fiscal flexibility. Now consider the strategic dilemmas this creates for major powers. For the United States, maintaining sanctions pressure limits Iran's capacity to project power, but it also incentivizes the development of parallel systems that could, over time, erode U.S. financial dominance. For China, engaging with Iran provides energy security and strategic leverage. But deeper integration risks exposure to sanctions that could affect its broader economic interests. For Russia, cooperation with Iran offers tactical benefits under shared sanctions pressure. But it does not provide a path to long-term stability for either economy. Project this forward. In 2 years, if current trends continue, Iran's fiscal space narrows further. Currency pressure intensifies. Domestic adjustments become more difficult. In 5 years, sustained underinvestment in infrastructure and industry begins to limit productive capacity. In 10 years, without structural change, the economy risks entering a cycle where recovery becomes dependent on external conditions that it does not control. What would course correction require? It would require partial reintegration into the global financial system. That implies negotiations over sanctions relief, likely tied to nuclear constraints or regional behavior. It would also require internal economic reforms to stabilize currency and reduce inflation. Both steps carry political costs. Externally, concessions may be seen as capitulation. Internally, reforms can disrupt entrenched interests. Who pays that price? The leadership if it chooses engagement. The population if it does not. This is the strategic dilemma. There is no path that avoids cost. Only choices about how that cost is distributed over time and across actors, which leads directly to a factor that has not yet been fully considered. The factor that has received the least attention is not outside Iran. It is inside it. Economic pressure does not translate automatically into political change. That assumption has failed repeatedly in different contexts. What matters is how pressure interacts with the internal structure of the state. Iran's political system combines elected institutions with unelected bodies that hold significant authority, including the Supreme Leader and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. On the surface, this structure provides resilience. Power is distributed in a way that prevents rapid systemic collapse. Different institutions can absorb shocks. Elections allow for limited adjustment of public sentiment without altering core strategic direction. This has allowed Iran to endure decades of sanctions and external pressure. Look one layer deeper. That same structure can slow decision-making when rapid adjustment is required. Economic reforms that would stabilize currency or reduce inflation may conflict with the interests of powerful internal actors. For example, segments of the economy linked to the IRGC benefit from sanctions conditions that limit competition and create controlled markets. This creates a paradox. The system that provides resilience also creates inertia. One layer deeper again. The consequence is that economic deterioration can continue longer than expected without triggering decisive policy change. This delays collapse, but it also increases its eventual severity. Historical precedents show similar patterns. In the late Soviet period, internal structures delayed reform until economic conditions had deteriorated significantly. When change came, it was abrupt and destabilizing. There is also a demographic dimension. Iran has a relatively young population compared to many developed economies. Youth unemployment has been a persistent issue. Verify current Iranian youth unemployment rate 2025-2026. High inflation erodes purchasing power. Over time, this affects social stability. But the relationship is not linear. Discontent does not automatically translate into coordinated political action. It can remain diffuse. The role of the supreme leader, currently Ali Khamenei, becomes central here. His position is not simply symbolic, it is the focal point of strategic continuity. Any transition at that level introduces uncertainty. Succession is not a routine administrative process. It is a moment where different factions may attempt to influence direction. If such a transition occurs under economic strain, the system faces compounded risk. There is one more element often overlooked: the role of regional perception. Iran's domestic legitimacy is partly tied to its external posture. Resistance against external pressure is framed as a core principle. Adjusting that posture under economic strain can be interpreted internally as weakness. This constrains policy options. It is not just a question of what is economically rational, it is a question of what is politically survivable. The surface shows a state that is endured. The deeper layer shows a system balancing resilience against rigidity. The deepest layer shows that the timing of internal decisions, not just external pressure, will determine the trajectory, which brings the analysis to the point where all these pressures begin to converge. If this analysis is reaching you, it means the system that filters information has not completely closed. Subscribing and sharing is not promotion. It is transmission. It allows this kind of work to reach people who are trying to understand what is actually happening, not what is being presented. So what does all of this actually tell us? It tells us the collapse is not a single event. It is an alignment of pressures that reinforce each other over time. Financial isolation limits revenue quality. That weakens the state's ability to sustain external commitments. Those commitments, in turn, increase fiscal strain. Diplomacy cannot offset this because the partnerships involved are transactional, not structural. China buys oil, but at discounted rates and through constrained channels. Russia cooperates, but under its own sanctions pressure. India maintains access, but avoids risk. No actor provides a full economic backstop. At the same time, the enforcement architecture of the global financial system remains intact. Secondary sanctions still force third parties to choose. Most choose access to dollar clearing. That keeps Iran operating in parallel systems with higher costs and lower efficiency. Shipping insurance constraints, particularly outside the international group of P&I clubs framework, continue to raise transaction risk for energy exports. Around 20% of global petroleum flows through the Strait of Hormuz, yet instability there now increases costs for the very country that depends on that route most. Inside the state, resilience and rigidity coexist. Institutions absorb pressure but also slow adaptation. Economic deterioration extends longer than expected, while policy change lags behind it. The result is a narrowing corridor where every option carries cost. External adjustment risks internal legitimacy. Internal delay increases external vulnerability. No single angle explains this. Together, they describe a system where time itself has become a constraint, not an asset. And before this analysis ends, there is one more thing that needs to be said clearly. The evidence points to 3 developments that will define the next phase. First, watch the trajectory of Iran's currency against the dollar in unofficial markets. Sustained depreciation signals accelerating internal strain. Second, monitor enforcement actions against shadow fleet shipping and intermediaries. Increased seizures or sanctions would tighten export capacity further. Third, observe any movement toward renewed nuclear negotiations or interim agreements. Even limited concessions would indicate recognition of financial pressure. None of these guarantee a specific outcome. States can endure longer than models predict. External shocks can alter trajectories quickly. But the direction is measurable. If currency pressure intensifies, enforcement tightens, and diplomacy remains stalled, the system moves closer to a point where adjustment is no longer optional. If even one of these variables shifts, the timeline changes. The structure does not. This analysis is provided for educational and informational purposes only. It does not constitute policy advice, intelligence assessment, or advocacy for any government or political position. The conclusions presented here are drawn from publicly available data, including economic reports, energy flow statistics, and documented policy actions. They represent an independent analytical view, not an institutional position. The voice you are hearing in this video is AI-generated. It is used to deliver the analysis clearly and consistently. You should consult multiple sources, compare interpretations, and form your own conclusions based on the evidence available. Understanding how power actually moves is not a passive activity. It requires attention to signals that are often quiet and dispersed. Choosing to follow those signals rather than the dominant narrative is one of the most consequential decisions you can make. Share this with one person you know who should understand what is unfolding. Not a broad audience, one person who will think about it carefully. Leave a comment with your reading of where this goes next, or the country you are watching most closely right now. Each response and each share extends the reach of analysis that is trying to describe reality as it is, not as it is presented. The next development will not arrive where most people are looking. I am Professor Liang Wu. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and never mistake a quiet news day for the absence of history being made.